Okay, we're going to start now from the next section. The Gemara says, Amal Rabbi Yochanan. So again, to summarize, what we saw so far was that we had Hillel the Amora, who said you can't eat them together because mitzvot, they cancel each other out nowadays. One is Doraita, one is Rabbanan. The Rabbanan overrides the Doraita, either because it's Doraita Rabbanan or because it's Maror, and Maror has a very strong flavor. Then we saw that we said even the one who says mitzvot don't cancel each other in general would hold that in this case they do nullify each other out. One would nullify the other, the Maror would nullify the Matza. Then the Gemara is now going to come and say, do people actually disagree? What Ravina seemed to imply is that there are those who think, we then ended with Hillel. Hillel is the one who says mitzvot clearly don't nullify each other because otherwise how could you eat the matzah and the maror together? So comes Rabbi Yochanan, he says, I want you to know, Cholkin alav chevrav al Hillel. Hillel's friends disagreed with him. It doesn't necessarily mean it was his friends. It means other people disagree. How do we know they disagree? And now we have a bit of a strange line. We bring a braita, which again darshans the same pasuk. I told you in the beginning we were going to read it in different manners today. Before we saw Amatzot Marim Yochlu was Hillel's proof. That's how you know you eat them together. This is going to prove the opposite, or not exactly the opposite, and that's a bit of a problem. Yachol Tanya, as it says in a braita, Yachol Yehei Korcham Bevatacha. By the way, the structure of Yachol is a structure of what we call a midrash halacha. It's deriving the halacha from a verse, and it starts off with you might have thought. Yachol means you might have thought. You might have thought Yehei Korcham Bevatachat. Be'ochlan, maybe you do put them all together, which is exactly what Hillel thinks. Kederech shehilel ochlan, the same way Hillel did. You might have thought that's the way to do it. Talmud Lomar, the pasuk says, Al matzot u'merorim yochluhu, afilu zebifnei atzmo v'zebifnei atzmo. Now, if the word afilu wasn't here, it would make perfect sense. What did they say? Al matzot u'merorim yochluhu. I'm going to particularly ignore afilu right now. Al matzot u'merorim yochluhu means yochluhu. Remember when I read it before, I said you eat it. It seems to imply just one at a time. Therefore, they learn one by itself and the other by itself, meaning you don't eat them all together. Now, there's something a little bit strange, though, because it says here, and that proves, if you didn't have the word afilu, that would clearly prove that those people obviously think that matzah, maror, and pesach, for all intents and purposes, right, the sacrifice, can't all be eaten together because the mitzvot nullify each other. However, the problem is that Rabbi Yochanan's statement says afilu, even zebifnei atzmo v'zebifnei atzmo. The second you add that word even, it sounds like you can do it together, but you don't have to. Now, that's not at all what Rabbi Yochanan was trying to say. Rabbi Yochanan was trying to bring people who disagree with Hillel, meaning they disagree and they think that mitzvot nullify each other. And therefore, that wouldn't make sense according to what he says, which is why I'm going to skip the Rashbam right now, which is why Matkifla Rav Ashi. Rav Ashi comes and says, Ihachi maya filu. What's the word afilu doing there, according to what you're saying? And therefore, Ela Amar Rav Ashi. And we're going to have two readings of Rav Ashi, and there's two different versions of the text, which causes two different explanations of what Rav Ashi says. We obviously only have what we read right here, but we're going to see commentaries that had a few different words after the words Amar Rav Ashi. So again, as I told you last time, right, the scribes copied by hand all of the texts of the Gemara, and that sometimes led to mistakes. So it says here, Rav Ashi now comes and explains, Hi Tana, Hachi Katana, the Tana that you just quoted, this is how it should read. Yachol lo yatsa behen yedei chovato elim ken korcham bevatacha ve'ochlan kederech shehilel ochlan. You might have thought, now there's two different ways to read this. Well, I'll start with one. You might have thought that you can't fulfill your obligation unless it has to be done by putting them together, just like Hillel did. Talmud Lomar, Al matzot u'merorim yochlu, the pasuk comes to teach you, afilu zebifnei atzmo v'zebifnei atzmo. Now, according to this reading, this has nothing to do, nobody disagrees with Hillel here in terms of our mitzvot. Nobody here says mitzvot nullify one to the other. No, they agree with Hillel that you could eat them all together. All they're coming to say is you don't have to say that. And then this leads us to, well, looking now at the Rashbam's commentary, he says, according to this, Rav Ashi isn't saying, I disagree with you. I agree with you that someone holds mitzvot nullify each other. It's just not this source, okay? So this source is coming to say there's Hillel, okay? There's another opinion. In a sense, what happens is Hillel is saying you should eat them together. The other opinion in the Braita is saying you don't have to. You can, you don't have to, which means they're not really disagreeing. Still, there's someone else who holds mitzvot nullify each other. They're just not mentioned here at all. Okay? And the Bala Maror says the same thing. He basically says, we just have, it just must have been a Kabbalah. In other words, we must assume there is someone who holds mitzvot nullify each other. We just don't know where we get it from. As Rabbi Yochanan tried to prove from this Braita doesn't prove it, but clearly there is someone who holds that way. However, according to this, the Mohammed Hashem comes and says this. He says, Amar Kotev, Megihas Farim Garmulo Lebala Maor Litvos Al Rabbeinu. In other words, they obviously must have had a different version. And he says, and that's not a correct version. What motivated them to read the Gemara that way? So their version said, El Amar Rav Ashi, Hai Tana Dihilelhi. When Rav Ashi commented on that Braita, it's not the way it appears by us, that Hai Tana Hachikatane, this is what that Tana meant. No, that Tana is Hillel. In other words, Rabbi Yochanan tried to bring this as proof that people disagree with Hillel. And Rav Ashi comes and says, no, that actually matches Hillel. That Braita doesn't go against Hillel. It works together with Hillel. Okay, and again, I'll grant you that someone thinks mitzvot nullify each other. It's just not this Braita. However, the Mohammed Hashem, which is written by the Ramban, just to give you a little background, the Bala Maror, the Maror Katan, and the Mohammed Hashem are both commentaries on the Rif. You can find it on the pages of the Rif, which come in the back of, if you have a big Gemara, it comes in the back of the Gemara. The Rif was, the Bala Maror attacks the Rif, and the Mohammed Hashem, why is he called Mohammed Hashem? I'm fighting the battle of God to protect the Rif from the attack of the Bala Maror. So that's why he basically comes and he says the Bala Maror was mistaken. They actually get into a lot of heated discussions, and the Ramban has very strong language against him. Here he says it very explicitly. You clearly had a bad text in front of you, okay, and it was wrong. We have much better versions, and Einar Gersa came. Okay, and then, so he says, the Tana of Hillel, okay, so let's read it actually here. Let's show it in the chart. I don't want to read everything inside now because we don't have a lot of time. But what he basically says, and his commentary is much longer, I kind of cut it short. But he basically says that according to Rav Ashi, okay, and here's the chart. According to Rav Ashi, the rabbis of the Braita, now according to this, they do disagree with Hillel. But on what point do they disagree with Hillel? Not about mitzvot mevatlot zoetzo. If you notice in the words of Rabbi Yochanan, it never said the words mitzvot mevatlot zoetzo. He just says that the friends of Hillel disagree with Hillel. So we assume disagree because Hillel thinks mitzvot don't nullify each other, and they think they do. But according to the Ramban, they do disagree. He has the original nusach, that they really do disagree. And he's just trying to come and re-explain the Braita. How do they disagree? And here, what's the important part? Because according to the Rashbam and the Bala Maror, they're not disagreeing because Hillel thinks you can also do it. It's just ideally you should do them together, but you don't have to. According to this, the second reading, the Ramban's reading, Hillel thinks you must eat them together. And then come the friends who disagree, and what do they say? No, you can, you don't have to. It's not the only way to do the mitzvah. Now, according to this, they do disagree, okay, in terms of my chart. Do they disagree? Yes, they disagree, okay? Where is it derived from? The Braita, okay? Now, how do we know? In the other version, that Rabbi Yochanan says the rabbis disagree with him, he has a tradition, but from here it comes directly from the Braita. Now, they have different wording of the Braita, and the main thing is, according to the Ramban, we don't necessarily have anybody who holds that the mitzvot nullify each other, which is very interesting because the Sugiyot did seem to indicate that. And Rav Ashi basically seems to be going against Ravina from the beginning and saying, you said there's someone who holds mitzvot can nullify each other. I don't think anybody actually thinks that. Comes to a very different, this is like a good example. I know it's a little bit complicated, but it shows you there's two very different ways to read the sugya, and you come to different conclusions as a result. Okay, we're going to skip the mechilta right now, okay, and we're going to move on to the end of the Gemara. The Gemara now says, Hashta de lo itmar hilchata lo ki Hillel velo ki Rabbanan. This is a very strange line also. Why is it strange? Because Hillel and Rabbanan were debating what happened in the time of the temple and not what's happening now. However, it's not clear whether we hold like Hillel that you eat them all together, or we hold like the rabbis. Now, again, there's two different ways of reading this. Either we hold like Hillel, you have to put them together, and the rabbis who said you don't have to, but you can, but that's all the Ramban. Or we say, right, and that's how we explain the previous sentence is going to affect how we explain this. Or we say we don't know whether we hold mitzvot nullify each other or mitzvot don't nullify each other. Okay? Now, so since we don't know, what should we do today? We should mivarech al achilat matzah ve'achil. Hadran mivarech al achilat maror ve'achil, right? We make the blessing on the matzah and we eat it. We make the blessing on the maror and we eat it. V'hadar achil matzah v'chasa b'hadei adadei, and then we eat them together below bracha zecher lemikdash kehillel. Okay, now this we're all familiar with from the Seder, this zecher lemikdash kehillel, which means that because we want to remember. Okay, now there's a whole bunch of mitzvot that we do to remember how they were in the temple. I'll give you a really good example that you might not even know this. Lulav, in the time of the temple, people took the lulav one day, only one day. In the Beit HaMikdash, they took it 7 days. It became a halacha that we do it the way they do it in the Beit HaMikdash, and it turned into halacha. And there's two different approaches here. When we say zecher lemikdash kehillel, we want to do it like Hillel. Now, if we want to do it like Hillel, then why wouldn't we just eat them all together? Right? This goes back to my original question, is to maybe the more obvious choice would be to just eat them all together. But since there's possibly a halacha like the rabbis, and since, if you remember, that nowadays we have this issue that what will happen nowadays that we have Rabbanit and Doraita, the Rabbanan overrides the Doraita, and basically we're going to end up, you can't eat them together at first, because if you eat them at first together, you eat the matzah with the maror, your matzah is as if it's not there. So that's why we have to start with the matzah, then eat the maror, right? Now, theoretically, this is why Hillel comes in. You could theoretically have just eaten the maror together with the matzah, because remember, the matzah overrides the maror. So you could eat the matzah, and then you could eat maror and matzah together, okay? Because according to Hillel, mitzvot lo mevatzlot zo et zo, only if it's d'oraita d'Rabbanan, and then the d'Rabbanan will override it. So that's why, according to the rabbis, though, in other words, here we have this combination approach. According to the rabbis, even that can't be, right? Mitzvot mevatzlot zo et zo, which means you can't eat the maror together with the matzah and fulfill your obligation. So that's why we have to do the matzah. Then we do the maror, and then we do zecher lemikdash kehillel. And now there becomes this debate in halacha. And this is a very interesting debate, and I'll leave you with this, which is, if we're doing this to remember what it was in the time of the temple, which sounds kind of like it's a nice thing to do, right? But it's not necessarily halacha. However, if you view it like lulav and etrog, nobody will say, oh, only take the lulav the first day because, right, we're only doing it zecher lemikdash, right? But they take it very seriously. So the Shulchan Aruch takes this very seriously and says this zecher lemikdash kehillel is halacha. And therefore, what does he say? You're not allowed to talk. I'm not going to read this whole thing inside, but you can look at it on your own. You're not allowed to talk from the time you wash. You can't talk until you eat the matzah, right? Now, when we say can't talk, it doesn't mean you can't say anything. It means you can only talk about things that are related to the mitzvah. You can't start talking about something else, right? Oh, what's coming up in the meal? What are we eating next? And, when do we bring the food? And I'm hungry or whatever else. Can't talk about that, but you can talk about things that have to do with the matzah and the maror, like pass the lettuce. I need some lettuce for my sandwich. That's okay. But he basically says, since we might be only fulfilling our obligation when we eat them together, because that's the ideal mitzvah, the way they did it in the time of the temple. So maybe we need to do it that way also. He says you cannot talk in between eating matzah and eating the maror and eating the sandwich. That's the Shulchan Aruch. The Aruch HaShulchan, who's a commentary from the late 1900s, late 19th century, he says that no. He says, if you did talk, like, yeah, ideally you shouldn't, because really this is all part of the same thing. But he says you don't need to make a bracha. You don't need to say it again. In other words, you did not fulfill your obligation. He says, because this isn't from the Torah, and right, it's just a way of remembering. So in terms of, there's two approaches to this korech, right? What we saw today was, number one, there's these two approaches to do mitzvot nullify each other. Even the one who says they don't nullify each other, they do when it's maror and matzah, which we don't know how far to take it. Is it just food-related issues? Is it also any mitzvah? And then it would be d'oraita d'Rabbanan, right? Where something that's optional overrides your your main mitzvah, and that weakens it, and we can't do that. Then we went from there to trying to understand, does someone really say that mitzvah nullify each other? And we saw a debate. It's not so clear whether really somebody says it or maybe not. Maybe there really is no other approach to this argument. And then we saw how, right, what do we do nowadays? We keep the Zecher L'Mikdash, and do we do the Zecher L'Mikdash again? Is it a halacha, like a real, we want to do it exactly how they did it then, like lulav, and then you have to keep a very serious, in a halachic framework, by saying basically that we have to make sure that you don't talk at all and don't have, because really I didn't really explain this, but what's the obvious? You have to make a blessing right before you do the mitzvah. So that's why you can't talk, because your blessing of al chilat matzah and al chilat maror, by the way, when they ate it together, there was a different blessing. It was I forget, the Rambam has it, and it appears in the Rambam, al chilat matzah maror, something, I forget exactly the wording, but eating them together. And then our brachot from before have to apply here also. So then you can't talk at all. Or do we say this is just a nice way to remember what Hillel did, even though this isn't really halacha? It's just a nice way to remember it. And then the halachic issues become less significant in terms of not talking in between. So these are different approaches to this famous korech sandwich. And I hope it gave you some food for thought, as we say. And we'll end here and open it up for questions now.